The vast majority of individuals do not experience a sense of being burdened because their external circumstances are crumbling. Rather, they feel drained because their internal landscape never achieves a state of stillness. When a challenge emerges, it instantly dominates their entire conscious awareness. You find yourself contemplating it while performing morning rituals, you carry the weight of it into every social interaction, and you remain awake during the night repeating the same internal monologues, hoping that excessive contemplation will eventually produce a moment of sudden insight. However, such a breakthrough remains elusive, for applying more mental pressure is fundamentally different from achieving mental transparency. You do not lose vitality due to the specific obstacle itself. You lose vitality because your mental focus remains imprisoned by it. When your psyche becomes obsessed with what is malfunctioning, it gradually loses the ability to visualize a path forward. Emotional responses take control, your perspective becomes restricted, and even basic choices begin to feel incredibly taxing. If you have ever felt intellectually depleted without engaging in physical labor, if you have noticed how a single lingering issue can sap your enthusiasm for all other pursuits, or if you have told yourself that you understand the necessary steps yet remain paralyzed, this presentation is intended for you. This is not due to a personal flaw, a lack of self-control, or a deficiency in intellect, but rather because the art of directing your focus during turbulent times was never part of your education. This discussion does not center on forced optimism. It is not about disregarding difficulties or maintaining a facade that everything is perfect, and it certainly does not involve demanding that you manufacture motivation. Instead, this is about rewiring your cognitive reactions. There is a fundamental reality that most people fail to investigate. The external situation is rarely the primary hazard. The way your consciousness responds to that situation is the true variable. A mind that remains anchored to its troubles begins to shrink. It becomes rigid, feeling more restricted and powerless with every cyclical thought. Conversely, a mind conditioned to seek pathways out of difficulty begins to grow. It reclaims authority, transitioning from instinctive emotional reactions to intentional movements. That transformation alters your entire reality. When you concentrate exclusively on deficiencies, your biological system remains in a state of high alert, your body prepares for a crisis rather than progress, and clear vision fades away. However, when you pivot toward the immediate next step, regardless of how minor it seems, your internal system finds balance, your breathing stabilizes, your intellect becomes precise, and your forward drive quietly returns. This audio experience is crafted to lead you back to that centered state. Throughout the following hour, you will not be pressured to fix your entire existence. You will not be expected to implement radical shifts or establish impossible benchmarks. Instead, you will be invited to engage in something far more impactful. You will discover how to break the repetitive mental patterns that keep you stagnant. You will learn to distinguish objective facts from the elaborate narratives your feelings create. You will learn to reclaim your clarity when your inner world feels congested and chaotic. Most importantly, you will master the skill of pointing your intellect toward resolutions rather than fueling the problems themselves. Clarity is not a destination you wait to reach, it is a discipline you actively perform. When the mind achieves transparency, taking action becomes uncomplicated, not necessarily effortless, but uncomplicated. By the conclusion of this journey, you will not find that life has suddenly become devoid of obstacles, but you will feel more stable, more centered, and more capable of addressing difficulties without being engulfed by them. This is the point where serenity replaces agitation. This is where deliberate focus replaces the exhaustion of overthinking. This is where you cease questioning why events occur and begin determining how to proceed. We shall now commence. Section 1. Obstacles are not the adversary. Most individuals perceive challenges as direct threats, objects of fear to be avoided or things that must vanish before peace can be restored. Yet, that specific conviction often inflicts more harm than the actual situation. A hurdle is not a foe. It does not manifest to penalize you, it appears to provide data about your surroundings, your routines, your choices, or your current intellectual framework. The genuine risk arises when your consciousness interprets the presence of a struggle as evidence of a personal failing. When this occurs, your ability to think clearly evaporates. Rather than observing a scenario for what it truly is, the mind reacts with intense emotion. Inner tension escalates, thoughts accelerate, and the issue begins to appear more massive and personal than its actual dimensions. This is the junction where most people become immobile. They do not falter because the situation is impossible to resolve. They falter because they merge the external problem with their internal identity. They tell themselves that this should not be happening, or that a more capable version of themselves would not face such things. In that specific moment, the problem ceases to be useful information and transforms into a harsh critique. However, challenges were never intended to be measurements of your worth. They function as indicators, a sign that a particular area requires attention, a signal that a strategy needs refinement, or a notice that a distance exists between your current position and your desired goal. That is the extent of it. When you detach emotional intensity from the scenario, problems become neutral occurrences. They possess no inherent malice, they do not diminish your value, and they simply act as guides. Nevertheless, most minds are not conditioned to perceive them with such neutrality. From our earliest years, we are taught to link difficulties with personal failure. Errors imply a penalty, struggle suggests frailty, and hardship implies you are falling behind. Consequently, when obstacles emerge in the context of adult life, whether they involve financial stress, interpersonal friction, or career uncertainty, the nervous system responds as if a physical threat were imminent. The body becomes tense, the mind shifts into a defensive posture, and instead of inquiring, "What is this revealing?" the intellect asks, "How can I make this disappear?" That shift in focus changes the entire outcome. When your primary objective becomes the avoidance of discomfort rather than the comprehension of the situation, your cognitive range narrows. You become hurried, you overthink, and you rehearse the same worries without finding an exit. This is why difficulties feel so draining, not because they demand labor, but because the internal resistance to them evaporates your energy. An obstacle viewed with composure requires significantly less strength than one fought with emotional friction. Reflect on this deeply. Two individuals can encounter the exact same circumstance. One feels overwhelmed and trapped, while the other remains focused and decisive. The distinction is not found in their intelligence or their inherent bravery. It is found in their interpretation. One views the situation as a threat to their core safety. The other views it as a condition that simply requires a response. One withdraws into themselves, while the other moves outward toward the world. This instructional program is founded upon a fundamental but frequently overlooked concept. A challenge does not dictate your internal state. Your mental relationship with that challenge does. When you perceive obstacles as adversaries, your engagement with them is driven by emotional friction. Conversely, when you treat these hurdles as objective data, you interact with them through strategic logic. History demonstrates that strategic action consistently outperforms emotional reaction. This is the precise origin of mental transparency, recognizing that a difficulty is essentially unprocessed information. It exists simply because a particular element has not yet been addressed, refined, or resolved. Once you adopt this perspective, the emotional intensity begins to dissipate. Rather than concluding that a situation is destroying your life, you recognize that it is merely highlighting an area that requires management. This singular shift in perspective creates a vital distance, a gap between the occurrence and your response, between feeling and movement, providing the space where clarity naturally resurfaces. Most people fail to cultivate this necessary distance. They react with immediacy, allowing their thoughts to spiral and assigning a sense of urgency to situations where none truly exists. Often, this feeling of urgency is merely a psychological illusion fueled by heightened emotions. Sophisticated thinking begins when you intentionally slow the progression of a moment, not by disregarding the issue, but by refusing to allow it to seize control of your biological system. When a complication arises, your primary responsibility is not the immediate resolution of the matter. Your initial task is to stabilize your internal landscape, because an agitated mind is incapable of producing elegant or effective solutions. You do not require instant answers. You require a foundation of composure. Serenity allows you to perceive various alternatives, enables you to establish priorities, and permits you to identify what truly carries weight. Without this stillness, every issue appears of equal importance, and when everything is treated as a crisis, nothing reaches a true resolution. This is why emotional mastery is not an inherent character trait, but a developed competency. A disciplined intellect does not ignore discomfort, it observes it. It acknowledges the physical tension, the rapid thoughts, and the impulse to react, yet it chooses to pause rather than obey those primitive signals. That brief pause represents the pinnacle of personal power. Within that interval, the problem contracts back to its authentic proportions. It becomes manageable, distinct, and workable. The majority of obstacles are not inherently massive. They only appear monumental when viewed through the lens of emotional distortion. Once the emotional fog recedes, objective reality becomes visible. You begin to formulate superior inquiries. What specific portion of this falls within my sphere of influence? Which decision have I been hesitating to make? What minor action could I take right now to diminish this pressure even slightly? These are solution-centric questions that remain inaccessible, while the mind is preoccupied with defensive posturing. This discussion is not intended to downplay your hardships. It is about reconfiguring your connection to them. You do not need an existence free of challenges. You need a mind that remains resilient when they appear. When you cease treating obstacles as enemies, you stop squandering vitality by resisting reality. You redirect that energy toward constructive movement, and even a modest, imperfect step forward restores self-assurance. This happens not because the entire situation is resolved, but because you are no longer paralyzed. In the chapters that follow, you will discover how to fortify this capacity, how to prevent reactive feelings from obscuring your judgment, and how to perceive difficulties with objectivity rather than taking them personally. For the moment, hold this truth close. The problem is not your adversary, an untrained intellect is. The exact second you stop battling a situation with emotional resistance, you have taken the definitive first step toward genuine transparency. Chapter 2: Understanding why your intellect gravitates toward problems. It might seem counterintuitive, but your mind is not necessarily attempting to assist you when it fixates on difficulties. It is attempting to safeguard you. Comprehending this dynamic alters how you perceive your own cognitive patterns. The human brain evolved primarily to detect hazards, not to facilitate peaceful clarity. Long before the luxuries of modern stability, survival depended entirely on the ability to anticipate what might go wrong. That ancient programming remains active today. Consequently, when a challenge emerges, your mind does not evaluate whether obsessing over it is beneficial. It simply recognizes whether the feeling is familiar. Familiarity, even when it involves discomfort, often feels more secure to the primitive brain than the unknown. This explains why problems feel so magnetic. Your intellect returns to them repeatedly, not because the repetition produces results, but because the cycle creates a false sense of control. By maintaining a constant internal dialogue, you feel occupied. By feeling occupied, you feel engaged. And by feeling engaged, you convince yourself you are making progress even when your external reality remains stagnant. This is a particularly deceptive psychological snare. Excessive contemplation can masquerade as productivity, anxiety can be mistaken for responsibility, and rehearsing scenarios can feel like preparation. However, none of these habits ensure advancement. In fact, they frequently act as barriers to it. Your intellect prefers problems because they represent known territory. Solutions, by contrast, demand transition. They require choices and the acceptance of potential error, uncertainties that often make the nervous system uneasy. Thus, the mind frequently selects the perceived safety of remaining within the problem. This is the reason you may possess a clear understanding of what is malfunctioning yet still find it difficult to initiate a change. Identifying a problem requires no bravery. Executing a solution does. Furthermore, your mind often clings to difficulties because of an emotional payoff. Problems provide a target for various feelings to latch onto. Irritation, resentment, fear, and sadness all seek an object of focus, and a problem serves that purpose perfectly. Without conscious awareness, individuals often become emotionally attached to their struggles. They discuss them at length, revisit them constantly, and construct elaborate narratives around them. Eventually, the difficulty begins to integrate into their sense of self. They are no longer a person encountering a hurdle. They define themselves as someone perpetually navigating a specific hardship. This identity shift is subtle yet incredibly potent. Once an obstacle becomes a component of who you are, resolving it can feel like losing a piece of your identity. Consequently, the mind quietly resists a conclusion. The intellect reasons that the current pain is at least predictable, and unknown improvement feels like a greater risk than familiar misery. There is also a significant biological component to this behavior. When you concentrate on difficulties, your brain triggers the release of stress chemicals. These hormones temporarily heighten your alertness, making every detail seem urgent and vital. This chemical surge can deceive the mind into believing that significant work is being performed. However, chronic exposure to these stress markers eventually deactivates higher-level cognitive functions. Innovation declines, your perspective shrinks, and your options seem to vanish. Thus, the very state you enter to address the problem is the one that makes a resolution hardest to find. This is the central paradox of the human mind. It returns to troubles in an attempt to feel prepared, yet the longer it dwells there, the less equipped it becomes to actually move forward. An additional habit to observe is the human tendency toward narrative construction. The intellect is naturally uncomfortable with incomplete accounts. When an obstacle emerges, it immediately attempts to fabricate an explanation. Why did this occur? What are the implications? And what will the eventual outcome be? These inquiries are rarely neutral. They are saturated with preconceived notions. Rather than merely witnessing objective reality, the mind constructs a legend to make sense of the unknown. Once this narrative is established, the mind works tirelessly to protect it. If the legend is pessimistic, the difficulty feels permanent. If it is theatrical, the situation feels unmanageable. If the legend is personal, the problem feels like a definitive judgment on your character. Consequently, the intellect finds even more reason to remain fixated on the issue, because to challenge the problem would require challenging the narrative itself. Admitting the narrative might be false is a leap many are unwilling to take. This realization requires a high degree of awareness. Most individuals never slow down enough to notice this internal process unfolding. They treat their thoughts as absolute truths and assume their emotional reactions are perfect mirrors of reality. However, thoughts are simply neurological habits, and habits can be restructured through training. Once you recognize that your mind gravitates toward difficulties out of old conditioning rather than actual wisdom, you stop granting every intrusive thought your full attention. You cease asking why you cannot stop dwelling on a topic and begin asking what your mind hopes to gain by remaining there. That inquiry alone begins to dissolve the cycle, because the moment you view fixation as a learned pattern instead of a necessity, your freedom of choice returns. You are no longer in a struggle with your own mind. You are simply observing it. This observation creates a healthy distance. This discussion is not about criticizing the intellect. The mind is simply executing the functions it was programmed to perform. However, you no longer reside in an environment where constant danger detection is essential for survival. You live in a world where clarity, sound judgment, and composed decision-making are the true priorities, which means your internal software requires an update. You do not need to purge every problem from your existence. You simply need to stop allowing your mind to make a home within them. The next time you find yourself circling the same worry, pause and recall this truth. Your mind is not seeking a solution, it is seeking a sense of certainty. True certainty does not emerge from additional contemplation, it arises from intentional movement. In the following section, you will learn how to interrupt this cycle by distinguishing objective facts from the elaborate stories your mind weaves around them. Once the narrative dissolves, the situation loses its emotional power, and in that newfound space, clarity can finally return. Chapter 3: Distinguishing Objective Facts from Internal Narratives. A significant portion of mental distress does not originate from external events, but from the internal commentary regarding those events. This distinction is subtle, yet once it is identified, it becomes impossible to ignore. A fact is inherently neutral, a story is inherently emotional. A fact is a detail that could be captured by a recording device or documented without any personal bias. A story is the subjective meaning your intellect assigns to that specific fact. The mind creates these meanings almost instantaneously. When something goes astray, a communication is ignored, a strategy fails, or an error occurs, the fact remains simple, but the internal narrative becomes loud and intrusive. The narrative claims that such failures always occur. It suggests that you are falling behind your peers. It insists that this is evidence of your inadequacy. Suddenly, a minor incident is transformed into a massive burden. This is the point where mental transparency vanishes. When facts and narratives merge, your thinking loses its edge. You stop interacting with reality and start reacting to a biased interpretation. Many people fail to realize this is happening because these stories feel incredibly authentic. They arrive accompanied by strong feelings, a sense of urgency, and a deep familiarity. However, familiarity is not a substitute for truth. The mind generates these accounts to shield itself from the discomfort of the unknown. It would rather settle on a quick, inaccurate explanation than endure the tension of uncertainty. It fills in the blanks, assumes the intentions of others, forecasts negative results, and amplifies consequences. Because these narratives occur so rapidly, they feel instinctive, but being automatic does not make them accurate. The discipline that alters your entire perspective is the practice of pausing long enough to separate these two elements. Focus on the fact first and the narrative second. Let us examine this carefully. A fact answers the question of what happened, without any added flavor. A story attempts to answer what this event implies about your future, your value, or your identity. The complication arises when the mind treats the second answer as if it were just as objective as the first. Once that fusion occurs, emotion takes the lead. You experience anxiety not because of the event itself, but because of the narrative surrounding it. You feel defeated not because of the circumstances, but because of the weight you have attached to them. As long as the narrative remains unchallenged, the emotion will feel entirely justified. This is why many feel they cannot escape their current mood. They are correct. As long as the story remains intact, the feeling will persist. Clarity begins when you audit the narrative rather than fighting the fact. You do not debate reality. You investigate your interpretation of it. This approach is not about denial. It is about precision. When you separate facts from stories, obstacles shrink back to their authentic size. They do not necessarily disappear, but they stop carrying an exhausting amount of extra weight. Consider this simple exercise. When you feel a strong emotional trigger, stop and document exactly what occurred. Use no descriptive adjectives or personal theories, only observable details. That is the fact. Next, document everything your mind is claiming about that event, the assumptions, the worries, and the conclusions. That is the story. Most individuals are astonished when they try this for the first time. They realize that a minimal amount of their stress is caused by reality, while the vast majority is generated by interpretation. These internal stories often rely on absolute terms like always, never, or everyone. These are clear indicators of cognitive distortion. Reality is specific and grounded, whereas stories are broad and theatrical. Once you view the story clearly, you gain the power to change it. You can ask if this narrative is the only possibility or if it is even helpful. These questions do not erase the problem, but they do eliminate the exaggeration. And it is exaggeration, more than anything else, that drains your vital energy. A further essential realization is that narratives feel deeply personal, whereas objective data does not. The moment you detect your thoughts suggesting that an event reflects your core identity, you have drifted away from facts and into the realm of storytelling. This transition does not indicate a lack of strength, it simply confirms your humanity. However, achieving true transparency requires consistent mental exercise. A disciplined intellect does not attempt to bury these internal tales, it identifies them with precision. It observes that the mind is merely attempting to navigate through ambiguity, rather than accepting the narrative as an absolute reality. That subtle transition establishes a necessary emotional buffer. This distance fosters composure, which in turn reveals various alternatives for action. Without that psychological space, every obstacle feels like a definitive condemnation. With it, hurdles are transformed into manageable objectives. This represents the fundamental divide between reactive feeling and intentional strategy. Reactive thinking asks why life is unfair, while strategic thinking asks what information can be harvested from the situation. One approach depletes your inner resources, while the other replenishes them. You do not need to silence the storytelling mind, you simply need to revoke its authority over your life. By distinguishing between what is happening and what you are saying about it, you reclaim dominion over your mental focus. You cease providing fuel to unnecessary anxiety. You stop reacting to fabricated future disasters. You stop debating interpretations that were never grounded in truth. This approach does not result in passivity, it results in extreme accuracy. Such precision is the hallmark of quiet power. As you continue this journey, begin to notice how frequently your intellect merges observation with imagination without your consent. Do not judge this habit, simply witness it. Awareness by itself is enough to erode the strength of that pattern. In the subsequent section, we will expand upon this foundation by exploring how the management of feelings facilitates intellectual transparency. Once these internal stories lose their influence, your emotional landscape becomes a territory you can navigate with intent, rather than a force that dictates your direction. Chapter 4: The Mastery of Emotion as a Catalyst for Mental Transparency. Clarity does not vanish because of an intellectual deficit, it disappears because feelings have taken the steering wheel. The instant an emotion surges without guidance, your cognitive field narrows, your focus tightens, your options evaporate, and tasks that once seemed simple suddenly feel insurmountable. This is not a personal failure, it is a fundamental biological reaction. When your internal system detects a potential hazard, whether it is tangible or perceived, it prioritizes self-preservation over comprehension, favoring rapid response over accuracy and instinct over contemplation. This explains why emotional episodes carry such a false sense of urgency, and why choices made during these spikes are frequently the ones we later regret. Most individuals are under the impression that they must resolve the external issue before they can achieve inner peace, yet the actual sequence is the opposite. You must stabilize your internal world before the solution can be perceived. Managing your emotions is not synonymous with repression. It does not involve hiding your stress, irritation, or anxiety. Instead, it involves preventing those internal states from seizing control of your rational faculties. Unmanaged feelings transform standard challenges into perceived emergencies. Guided feelings transform those same challenges into logical sequences. Recall the last time you felt intellectually overwhelmed. Your thought patterns were likely repetitive, your muscles were tight, and your respiration was shallow. In that physiological state, creative thinking becomes impossible, your perspective vanishes, and even the most helpful guidance feels intrusive or irrelevant. This occurs not because the advice is flawed, but because your mind is not in a receptive state. This is why the management of your inner state is a foundational skill. Without it, no method succeeds, no plan is sustainable, and no answer feels within reach. A common error is waiting for an emotional wave to subside naturally. People often seek distractions or hope that the passage of time will dilute the intensity of their feelings. While this occasionally works, it often fails because emotions are sustained by the attention we give them. The more you mentally interact with a feeling, the longer it persists. The more you struggle against it, the more momentum it gains. True control starts with the act of interruption. The primary competency is identifying the rise of an emotion, not after it has overwhelmed you, but the exact moment it surfaces. This demands an acute awareness of your physical state, a tightening in the chest, a locked jaw, erratic breathing, or accelerating thoughts. These are not signs of fragility, they are sophisticated early warning systems. A focused mind detects these signals and chooses to pause. That pause is an act of deliberate will. In that moment, you cease trying to untangle the problem, you stop the internal playback of the story, and you pivot your attention toward physiological regulation. You slow your breathing, release the tension in your frame, and anchor your awareness in the immediate present. While this may appear basic, its simplicity does not diminish its profound impact. Restoring physical calm reopens access to your higher cognitive functions. When the body finds its center, the intellect naturally follows. This is why serenity is a strategic advantage. A centered mind can perceive subtle differences, establish logical orders, and separate the essential from the trivial. A mind clouded by emotion is incapable of such distinctions. Many resist this concept, fearing that a loss of emotional intensity equates to a loss of concern or commitment. However, emotional volatility is not the same as being effective. In reality, excessive emotional charge frequently prevents a resolution from manifesting. Contemplate this truth: no difficulty is resolved through the same emotional frequency that generated it. Tension does not alleviate tension. Irritation does not foster insight. Anxiety does not create solutions. These feelings merely act as indicators that something requires your focus. Once that signal is acknowledged, the volume must be lowered. This is the core discipline. You recognize the feeling, you validate its presence, and then you intentionally diminish its intensity. This is done through choice, not through force. This is where self-regulation transforms into empowerment. You are not discarding your feelings, you are directing them. To lead your emotions means deciding when they are allowed to provide input and when they must remain silent. When feelings lead, they demand immediate, impulsive relief. When logic leads, it searches for the next productive action. Both parts of you exist, but only one is fit to govern. Managing your internal state also fundamentally alters your experience of time. When you are under heavy emotional strain, every circumstance adopts a false sense of urgency. You feel an intense compulsion to decide immediately, a pressure to reply instantly, and a forced necessity to act without delay. However, this urgency is frequently a psychological mirage. The vast majority of challenges do not demand immediate intervention, they demand the appropriate intervention. Precision in action requires psychological space, and that space is manufactured through self-regulation. When you intentionally decelerate your response time, you gain significant strategic leverage. You cease reacting to fabricated consequences or shielding yourself from hypothetical disasters, and you begin to engage exclusively with the reality that is physically present. This state constitutes true intellectual transparency. It does not manifest as a sudden revelation but returns in increments as the volume of emotional noise is lowered. Once this clarity is restored, potential paths forward often appear much more obvious than previously imagined, not because the external situation evolved, but because your internal condition did. This discussion is not an invitation to become emotionally detached, it is a call to become emotionally proficient. Proficiency involves the wisdom to know when to engage and when to withdraw, when to honor a feeling and when to prioritize a thought, and when to pause versus when to execute. Without this competency, every hurdle feels like a personal indictment. With it, obstacles are categorized as technical variables. Technical variables are subject to resolution, whereas personalized problems can feel like an endless cycle. As you progress, hold this principle as a core truth: you do not achieve clarity by increasing your mental effort, you achieve it by first establishing inner stillness. Master your internal state, and your cognitive processes will align. In the following section, we will explore how solution-centric thinking is a cultivatable skill rather than an inherent personality trait. Once your emotions are guided, your mind transforms into a tool you can direct, rather than a burden you must simply endure. Chapter 5: The Development of Solution-Centric Thinking as a Refined Skill. There is a widespread misconception that certain individuals possess a natural gift for resolving difficulties. It is often attributed to raw talent, high intelligence, or innate confidence. Consequently, when others struggle to find a path forward, they quietly assume they lack an essential internal component. This perspective may offer a sense of comfort, but it is fundamentally inaccurate. Thinking toward a solution is not an inherited trait, it is a discipline that is developed. Much like any other expertise, it operates within a specific framework. Most people are never introduced to this framework. Standard education teaches us to identify hurdles, investigate their origins, and articulate the feelings they trigger, yet it fails to teach the transition from bewilderment to movement. Thus, when obstacles appear, individuals revert to familiar patterns. They ponder, they fret, they dissect, and they wait, confusing this high level of mental activity with actual progress. True solution-focused thinking begins exactly where the cycle of overthinking terminates. An intellect aimed at resolution does not ask superior questions because of a higher IQ. It asks them because it has been programmed to do so. The primary distinction you will observe is the direction of focus. Problem-centric thinking is inherently retrospective. It asks what went wrong and dwells on culpability, regret, and justifications. Solution-centric thinking is inherently prospective. It asks what the immediate next step is. It does not ignore history, but it refuses to be held captive by it. This forward-leaning orientation is not a matter of blind optimism, it is a matter of utility. A mind focused on resolution recognizes a vital truth: you cannot alter what has already transpired, but you can exert influence over what occurs next. That realization alone significantly diminishes internal resistance. The second major distinction involves the scale of focus. Problem-centric thinking tends to magnify and expand. It perceives every situation as massive, intricate, and exhausting. Solution-centric thinking is reductive. It deconstructs complex scenarios into the smallest possible actionable components. This is not because the problem is trivial, but because movement requires traction. Many individuals remain stagnant while waiting for a grand, perfect solution. They desire total clarity before they act and complete certainty before they move. However, clarity is rarely a prerequisite for action, it is more often a byproduct of it. This is why solution-focused thinking always commences with a singular, modest step. It need not be the ultimate step or even the perfect one, simply the next manageable one. This approach demands a high level of discipline. A focused mind poses three specific inquiries when encountering an obstacle. What specific element is within my control right now? What is the most minor action that will decrease the current friction? What can I execute today without requiring a surge of motivation? These questions successfully bypass emotional interference. They do not inquire about your current mood, they investigate the realm of the possible. This focus on possibility restores your sense of agency. Personal agency is the definitive cure for a sense of powerlessness. When you initiate even a minor action, your nervous system receives a vital communication. I am not paralyzed. That single signal shifts your entire internal state. Vitality returns, focus becomes sharp, and cognitive function improves. This confirms that action leads to clarity, rather than following it. Another pillar of this mindset is the acceptance of imperfection. A problem-focused mind craves absolute certainty and reassurance before committing to a path. A solution-focused mind accepts that uncertainty is a natural part of the journey. Such a mind understands that movement does not require confidence, it generates it. Waiting until a feeling of readiness arrives is a primary reason people stay trapped. Readiness is not an emotion you wait for, it is a choice you make. A disciplined intellect does not ask if it feels ready. It asks if a specific direction is preferable to remaining stationary. If the conclusion is affirmative, it proceeds. This is not a reckless impulse, it is the construction of momentum. Momentum serves as a far more effective teacher than static contemplation will ever be. An additional frequently ignored facet of solution-centric thinking involves the establishment of boundaries. Not every complication earns an unlimited share of your mental resources. Thinking that is anchored in difficulties tends to become obsessive. It classifies every minor issue as both critical and immediate. Conversely, thinking aimed at resolution focuses on prioritization. It inquires whether a specific concern is actually worthy of current vitality, and investigates the potential consequences of delaying a response. Often, the realization is quite revealing. Numerous challenges lose their perceived intensity when you intentionally withdraw your attention from them. They may resolve themselves independently, diminish in size, or simply reveal that their significance was largely a product of emotional projection. An intellect geared toward solutions is inherently selective. It recognizes that attention is a finite and precious asset. Wherever your attention is directed, your energy inevitably follows, and where energy is invested, outcomes eventually manifest. Consequently, high-level thinking involves recognizing the moments when abstaining from action is the superior choice. On occasion, the most powerful maneuver is to remain patient, accumulate further data, and allow the initial emotional surge to evaporate. However, in this context, waiting is a deliberate strategic choice. In a problem-focused mindset, waiting is merely a form of avoidance. The distinction lies entirely in the clarity of one's intent. Those who master this skill also possess a refined understanding of feedback. They do not view results as final judgments on their character. They view them as objective data points. If a method proves successful, they document the victory. If it fails, they refine the approach. There is no internal drama associated with this cycle. Failure is not interpreted as a personal deficiency. It is simply information regarding a tactic that did not yield the desired outcome. This perspective effectively removes the element of fear from taking action. When an error stops implying personal incapacity and begins to signify a need for tactical adjustment, forward motion becomes significantly easier to maintain. This explains why a solution-oriented disposition feels more tranquil. It is firmly rooted in objective reality rather than shifting emotions. It does not demand that you feel a surge of inspiration. It simply requires you to be fully present in the moment. This presence fundamentally alters how challenges are perceived. Instead of feeling victimized by external events, you feel actively engaged with them. You are no longer merely reacting to life, you are responding to it with purpose. That transition builds a profound sense of self-trust. True confidence does not emerge from a perfect record of success, but from the reliability of your own follow-through. Each minor action reinforces a growing identity. You are an individual who manages circumstances, not always with immediate perfection, but with unwavering consistency. Over time, this consistency generates a powerful compounding effect. Obstacles cease to feel like existential threats and begin to resemble intricate puzzles. This is not because the puzzles are inherently simple, but because you have mastered the methodology of the approach. This section focuses on reclaiming that latent ability. You do not require a fundamental change in personality. You require a more effective process, one that navigates you out of mental cycles and into productive movement, replacing a sense of being overwhelmed with a clear sense of direction. As you advance, remember that you are not immobile because the hurdle is too high. You are immobile because your mind has been conditioned to observe rather than to act. Train the mind to take the step, and transparency will naturally follow. Chapter 6: Eliminating the habit of asking ineffective questions. The overall caliber of your intellect is defined by the quality of the inquiries you pose to yourself. Most individuals routinely ask questions that subtly ensure they remain stagnant. They fail to recognize this because these inquiries feel natural, logical, and even sophisticated, yet they lead to a dead end. When a setback occurs, the mind instinctively asks why such things happen to them specifically. It asks why they always return to the same frustrations or what inherent flaw exists within them. While these questions appear to be deep or reflective, they function as psychological snares. They direct your focus inward in a destructive manner, encouraging repetitive rumination rather than a search for a way out. They push the intellect toward a search for justifications instead of a search for movement, and mere explanations do not alter physical reality. The mind finds these questions seductive because they offer a sense of activity without any accompanying risk. You can contemplate the origins of a problem indefinitely without ever having to take a step. You can dissect a situation endlessly without committing to a specific path. This is why the wrong questions are so hazardous. They simulate productivity while quietly eroding your forward drive. A shift toward resolution begins when you learn to disrupt this specific pattern. This is not achieved through forced optimism or by silencing your curiosity, but by asking questions that provide actual strategic leverage. The primary transformation involves moving from the concept of why to the concept of what. Inquiries based on the past tend to keep you anchored there, while inquiries focused on what pull you into the current moment. The present is the only domain where actual change is possible. A mind focused on outcomes understands that intellectual insight without accompanying action serves no purpose. Therefore, it conditions itself to pose questions that mandate an engagement with facts. Consider the most frequent ineffective inquiries. Why can I not organize my life? Why does this feel so difficult? Or why do others seem to avoid these struggles? None of these pathways lead to a solution. Instead, they invite unhelpful comparisons, harsh self-criticism, and a sense of powerlessness. Contrast those with a more effective set of inquiries. Which specific part of this situation can I influence right now? What is the most minor action that would improve the current state? Or what choice have I been actively avoiding? These questions may lack emotional theater, but they possess immense utility. They do not cater to the ego, they activate personal responsibility. Responsibility is not an admission of guilt, it is a claim of power. By asking superior questions, you fundamentally rewrite your connection to the challenge. You cease to view yourself as a passive recipient of circumstances and begin to see yourself as an active responder. This shift restores a sense of personal dignity. Another group of ineffective questions centers on the need for absolute certainty. People often worry about what might happen if they fail or if they make an incorrect choice. These questions appear cautious, but they result in paralysis. They operate on the false premise that perfect knowledge must precede any movement. However, life does not offer such guarantees. No significant progress occurs in the absence of ambiguity. Superior questions treat uncertainty as a standard condition rather than a barrier. Instead of fearing failure, ask what knowledge would be gained if the attempt did not succeed. Instead of searching for a single, right choice, ask which option facilitates even a small amount of progress. Forward motion provides the data needed for self-correction. Remaining stationary does not. An educated intellect recognizes this fundamental principle. It does not demand absolute guarantees. Instead, it pursues a clear sense of direction. Another minor but impactful error involves the use of emotionally charged inquiries. Questions such as why one possesses certain flaws or why one cannot simply perform better. These inquiries presuppose a personal deficiency before any objective data has been evaluated. They categorize a difficulty as a permanent character flaw rather than a temporary hurdle in skill or circumstance. Over time, this habit erodes one's internal confidence. A mind geared toward resolution consciously avoids questions rooted in identity. It ceases to ask what an event implies about its own value and instead asks what the situation demands in terms of action. The former perspective diminishes strength, while the latter builds it. When you stop putting your own worth on trial, you liberate a vast amount of energy for productive movement. Another vital distinction lies between inquiries that broaden your perspective and those that restrict it. Thinking focused on troubles is inherently narrow, it effectively shuts doors. Conversely, thinking focused on outcomes expands your view, leading you to consider unexplored options or to imagine how a situation might look if even a minor improvement occurred. This expansion provides the psychological breathing room necessary for transparency. Under significant strain, the intellect often gravitates toward extreme inquiries, leaping to catastrophic conclusions and treating transient struggles as permanent defeats. This is precisely why the way you frame your questions is so critical. They either pacify the nervous system or agitate it. A question focused on what can be achieved within the next 24 hours grounds you in the immediate present and in tangible effort. It lowers the emotional intensity and returns the problem to a manageable human scale. This approach is not about self-deception, it is about achieving high levels of precision. Accuracy in your internal language leads to accuracy in your thought processes, which ultimately results in effective execution. One of the most significant questions you can condition yourself to ask is what specific task you are currently avoiding. Avoidance frequently wears the mask of complex contemplation, excessive planning, or endless research. However, this avoidance is exactly what keeps the difficulty alive. The second you identify what you are shunning, the obstacle loses a portion of its influence. This is because avoidance provides fuel to uncertainty, and uncertainty is the primary source of fear. Taking action, even when it feels uncomfortable, is the most direct path to restoring mental clarity. This section is not about rote memorization of specific inquiries. It is about observing the physiological and psychological impact your internal dialogue has on your state. Do your questions facilitate progress or stagnation? Do they lead toward transparency or bewilderment? Toward personal authority or lingering resentment? You do not need to formulate a perfect inquiry. You simply need to formulate a functional one. Functional questions point toward movement, diminish emotional friction, and maintain a high regard for reality. As you move forward with this material, begin to audit the questions your mind generates instinctively. Witness them without judgment. Then, practice substituting them with inquiries that actually serve your objectives, questions that pull you forward. When you alter the nature of your questions, you fundamentally alter the nature of your thinking. As your thought patterns evolve, your entire relationship with challenges transforms. In the following section, you will learn to treat your focus as a physical muscle that can be strengthened, ensuring your attention stops drifting back to old frustrations and begins to support meaningful advancement. That conditioning begins with a heightened state of awareness. Chapter 7: Strengthening your focus as a cultivated discipline. Concentration is not an inherent trait that you either possess or lack. It is a capacity that is either developed through exercise or weakened by neglect. Many people operate under the false assumption that their attention is naturally fragile. They point to external distractions, modern technology, or a lack of self-control as the primary causes. However, the root of the issue is far less complex. Their power of focus has never been intentionally trained. Attention is essentially a product of habit. Your mind learns to return to whatever location you repeatedly place your awareness. This explains why complications often feel magnetic. Once your focus anchors itself to a specific concern, your mind continues to drift toward it even when no new information is present. This happens not because the situation requires it, but because your focus has been conditioned to sustain it. A disciplined mind recognizes this cycle and chooses to work with it rather than against it. The initial step is acknowledging that focus is a limited resource. You do not possess an infinite supply of cognitive vitality. Every minute spent re-examining a stagnant problem is a minute stolen from other vital areas of your life. This is the reason constant mental loops feel so exhausting. It is not the external obstacle itself that causes fatigue. It is the repetitive and involuntary redirection of your energy to the same internal point of stress. Training your focus begins with the simple act of noticing. Observe where your attention gravitates when it is not being consciously directed. Identify which specific thoughts exert a pull on your mind without your permission. Note how often your intellect revisits the same worries. This observation is not intended for self-criticism. It is intended to reveal existing patterns. Once a pattern is identified, it can be interrupted. One of the most powerful methods for strengthening focus is the concept of containment. Containment involves deciding exactly when and where a specific challenge is allowed to occupy your mental space. Most individuals allow their problems to wander freely through their minds, appearing during work, social interactions, or rest. A mind focused on solutions establishes clear boundaries. It determines that a specific issue will be addressed at a designated time and in a certain manner. Outside of that specific frame, attention is consciously moved elsewhere. This practice is not a form of denial, it is a high level of discipline. Without these boundaries, difficulties expand until they dominate your entire internal landscape. With them, those same difficulties contract. A practical technique involves time boxing, where you dedicate a precise window to analyze, document, or resolve an issue. When that window closes, your focus moves to the next task. When the problem attempts to resurface outside of that time, you remind yourself that it has already been scheduled for later. This conditions the intellect to respect your internal structure. A further compelling concept involves the principle of withdrawing nourishment from what you do not wish to cultivate. Attention is essentially a form of psychological sustenance. What you focus on thrives. What you ignore eventually withers. If you persistently provide anxious thoughts with the fuel of your attention, they will dominate your mental landscape. If you cease to nourish them, their intensity will inevitably fade. This transformation is not immediate, but it is entirely reliable. A common error is attempting to engage in a debate with intrusive thoughts. Trying to rationalize them away or suppress them only results in granting them more of your limited attention. A disciplined intellect adopts a more straightforward approach. It acknowledges the presence of the thought and redirects focus without any accompanying internal dialogue. This is done with composure rather than force, much like the gentle correction you apply when you realize your mind has wandered during a focused task. Concentration is fortified through this act of redirection, not through confrontation. Furthermore, focus is developed through intentional engagement with neutral, everyday activities. It is a misconception that concentration is only built during high-stakes labor. It is cultivated in every moment. When you engage in a meal, focus entirely on the act. When you move, be present in the movement. When you listen, provide your total presence. Each instance of returning your awareness to the current task reinforces your internal authority. This practice establishes a foundation of mental stability. A stabilized mind is inherently less reactive. It does not restlessly leap between thoughts in a search for stimulation. It remains exactly where you place it. This stability erodes the influence of problems because difficulties depend on fragmented attention to survive. It is also vital to distinguish between intentional focus and automatic fixation. Focus is a deliberate tool used for a purpose, while fixation is an involuntary cycle that depletes your vitality. Learning to identify this difference is crucial. Regularly inquire whether a specific line of thought is facilitating your forward progress. If it is not, it does not earn your full attention. This is a matter of strategic prioritization rather than avoidance. An intellect aimed at solutions asks what truly deserves focus at any given second, recognizing that the answer evolves throughout the day. Another frequent hurdle is the lingering of mental residue, that state where a portion of your attention remains tethered to a previous concern even after you have moved on to something else. When your attention is divided in this manner, your overall effectiveness suffers. Eliminating this residue requires a sense of closure. Even a minor act of finality, such as documenting a next step or establishing a specific reminder, allows the mind to release its grip. The intellect finds peace when it knows an issue has been formally acknowledged and scheduled for resolution. It is unfinished thinking that keeps the attention trapped. Strengthening your focus also demands a degree of patience. Your mind will inevitably drift. The objective is not to achieve a state of perfect stillness, but to notice the drift sooner and return to center more rapidly. Each act of returning is a psychological repetition that builds inner strength. Gradually, the intervals of clarity expand, the magnetic pull of old problems weakens, and your authority over your own attention increases. This evolution is quiet and incremental, but its power is immense. When you govern your focus, you govern what is allowed to grow within you. You stop fueling anxiety, you cease rehearsing catastrophes, and you end the cycle of repetitive thought. In that newly created space, clarity surfaces, not as a fleeting moment of brilliance, but as a consistent state of being. This journey is about reclaiming your attention to become deliberate in your actions. Because where your focus is directed, your life inevitably follows. In the concluding section, we will integrate these principles by exploring the character of a solution-centric mind, an identity that remains resilient under pressure and responds with composed direction and intent.